is a critical care specialist. And by the way, I'm Jerome McDonnell. I host Worldview at WBEZ, and I kind of forgot about that. But and I'm here because I'm glad to be in a room of people who care about this and want to do something and take action about this. And it's great to have people together thinking about this. Our first panelist is Zahir Salul, and he is a critical care specialist at Advocate Christ Medical Center and associate professor in clinical medicine at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And he is a recent past president of the Syrian American Medical Society. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the Syrian American Medical Society. Dr. Zahir Salul transformed it from kind of a technical training organization into one that is helping hundreds of thousands of Syrians in Syria and outside of Syria. And there was a piece on them on 60 Minutes last night. And he is just back from Bangladesh and has been in the camps just recently, so we thought we'd get his perspective first and hear about his experience there. Thanks for joining us here.
Thank you, Jerome, for this introduction, and thank you for being here. Maisa, thank you for inviting me.
So that you not have the Windows sign right on your forehead.
Sure.
We'll listen to it.
Is it good? So I was invited by coincidence. Maisa, I think, saw some of my posts on Facebook, and she Facebooked me, and she asked me to be here, and I said I will be happy to be here. And I got to know about the Rohingya ordeal a few years ago when Burma Task Force was created. One of my friends, Dr. or Imam Abdul Malik Mujahid, who was in some of your programs, started this coalition of 18-member organization to talk about the Rohingya when no one was paying attention to them. And frankly, I was not paying attention to them even in the past 4 years or 5 years because of what's happening in my homeland in Syria. I was consumed by the other genocide, I believe, that is happening in Syria, and it's very difficult to focus on too many disasters. I think that's, human nature. So when I was in London 4 months ago, and there was this, in a meeting in the Foreign Office, and I went out, and then there was this demonstration by Rohingya community in London, and they were very vocal, and they are demanding their rights. And I thought that this is something that we have not seen in Chicago. We have a Rohingya community in Chicago. I took a video of that demonstration, and I put it on my Facebook. And to my surprise, many people started to talk and tweet and repost that post on Facebook and talk about the Rohingya and what's happening to them. So I thought maybe this is something that is new, that people are paying more attention to the Rohingya right now. And somehow we reached a tipping point in the conflict that people started to talk about the Rohingya and understand the ordeal of these people who are one of the most persecuted countries in the world. At the same time, my colleagues and I, Dr. John Kaler is here, we started a new NGO called Mid Global to help people in disaster areas. We went into Yemen, we went to Puerto Rico. Dr. John Kaler was, of course, with me in Aleppo last year. We went to Greece, to Jordan, to other places. And we decided that we should do our part in helping the Rohingya community in Bangladesh. We've never been in Bangladesh before. So 2 months ago, a group of doctors and nurses, some of them from Chicago, went as a first mission to start a clinic in one of the largest camps in Bangladesh-Myanmar border, a camp called Palongkali. And for people who are familiar with the language, excuse my accent if that's not the way that it is pronounced. John Kaler was there for about 2.5 weeks before me, and if he can maybe say a few comments, that would be great. I came last week. I spent 1 week there with a group of physicians and nurses from Chicago. In the clinic, we started with 1 room, and now we have 8 rooms. We are seeing about 250 patients every day, young, old, and children, a lot of children. And each one of them, when you have time as a physician, you ask, why are you here? And each one of them has this painful story that is probably becoming very familiar to all of us if you are following what's happening to the Rohingya. All of them describe the same thing. And they're from different villages and stories. The Senator Durbin and Congressman Shikowsky were there with the congressional delegation visiting the area at the same time when we were there. And our ambassador to Bangladesh was with them, Ambassador Wilson, and she asked me, could they be lying? And I said it's impossible for 650,000 people to lie and repeat the same lie, each one of them. And these are people who came from different villages. I mean, she did not think that they were lying, but she wanted to counter-argument the Myanmar government, who were saying that these people are lying, they're just spreading rumors. And I told her, I've heard the same stories, from different villages. One of the villages I remember was Saira Farah, and I saw this elderly man who came in, and he said that he spent 6 days walking from the village to Bangladesh. He lost some of the family members who were shot by the military. He described a group of Buddhist monks, which was, to me, it's very surprising that you have Buddhist monks participating in the massacres who came to the village, and they burned the houses. They threw some of the children in the fire. And the people of the village left. All of them have fled. And he had about, I think, 3,000 people in that village. I saw women who were raped. I saw children who were burned, and they had signs of burning on their back. I saw young men who were wounded. I saw a young woman who was, while she was fleeing, she fractured her leg, and there was no one to attend to the leg, so she had deformity in the leg, and we were trying to help her to see if there's any orthopedic surgeon who can help her fracture. She was 18 years old, and she came every day because she wanted to fix her fracture, so hopefully she can have a better future. We went and visited one of the camps in Balukali, which has 300,000 people in a camp. And we went to the top of the hill. I think, John, maybe you visited there. And you see the sea of tents around you. I took pictures. I was hoping that I can show some of these pictures and video. Sea of tents. And these are not the tents that I saw them in Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey and Greece, that Syrians were there. Syrians were in luxury, I can tell you. The tents that they were there for them in Al-Zatari camp, Al-Azraq camp in Greece were very nice tents, and they can they are heat insulated, so it's warm inside the tent, and they were provided by UNHCR. But these tents are very basic tents. They're dark in color, so when you're inside the tent, you feel like you are in a steam room. I went inside the tent, and there's nothing inside the tent. I mean, there's mud, and people were sleeping on the mud, and they had nothing else. And then I started to talk about this with some of the men there, and some of them cried on, when they were talking to me. And for middle-aged men to cry in that culture is something that is not usual. I didn't do anything but to hug them, and I told them that I'm gonna, be your voice. I'll help bringing your voice. I asked them, actually, what do you want us to do in United States of America? I came from America. And the elder of that community, he said, we don't expect anything from the people. We only trust God. So, I mean, I was voiceless. This is a community that has been persecuted. Syrians are picky. When you ask them, what do you want us to do? They will tell you a list of 200 things. But Rohingya are not picky. And they did not want anything from us. And they did not expect anything from us because they've been under persecution for the past 50 years or so. So these are some of the reflections. I mean, I hope that we pay attention to the Rohingya people. The first thing if you want to change policy is to start paying attention and educate yourself and then educate your congressman and senator and tell them that this is something that we have to care about. Our ambassador to the United Nations, Ambassador Samantha Power, wrote a book about genocide called The Problem of Hell. I reminded her in one of the meetings that this is happening under your watch in Syria and other places. She tried to deflect that criticism. People in power tried to underestimate what's happening in Yemen and in Bangladesh, in Myanmar and in Syria, because they don't want to act. By law, we have to act as a country, and the United Nations has to act as an agency if there is a genocide. And that's why you see all of these politicking, that this is not an ethnic cleansing, this is maybe not a genocide, this is maybe the Muslims are destroying their own mosques and homes, they are terrorism. All of these terms that are thrown is to prevent our policymakers from calling it what it is, which is a genocide against a minority in Myanmar, and we have to call it as it is and ask everyone to act accordingly. Thank you.
Next, we're going to hear from Brad Sugar. He is with the American Jewish World Service. I hope some of you are familiar with their work. They do incredible things all across the globe. They're a great NGO that's out there providing services of a wide and disparate manner. And Brad is going to have a few things to say about what American Jewish World Service and he is thinking and doing about what's happening with the Rohingya. Hey, Brad.
Good evening. I wanted to thank all of the organizers for putting this together and inviting me. I feel privileged and honored to be among you, and what a true remarkable display of interreligious dialogue, communication, and these are the types of events that we need. I'll talk briefly. I was asked to sort of present a Jewish narrative on this. I don't think empathy is a Jewish narrative. I don't think it is a Jewish construct. We, as AJWS, which I'll get into in a little bit, believe from the Jewish tradition that every human being, no matter race, religion, or creed, is imbued with a little bit of a spark of the divine. In Hebrew, that's called B'Tselem Elokim. We are created in the image of God. Every human being, every life is sacred, and that's a fundamental value. It's certainly not a unique Jewish value, but it's one of the core Jewish values. And AJWS, which I'll get to in a minute, I just also want to say that I'm a grandson of Holocaust survivors. My grandparents are no longer living, but I have heard from them and many of the horrors that they had. And they always said, I wish someone would have done something about this. We are here. We can do something about this. Genocide is prevalent. It is here. And so AJWS really focuses right now on 5 main areas, particularly with the Rohingya and in Burma. The first of which is AJWS has been in Burma for about 15 years. We are a grassroots organization working to realize human rights and end poverty in the developing world. We're a network of global citizens raising support and awareness for the Rohingya as well as many other vulnerable people across the world. The things that we're doing specifically right now to help the situation are providing immediate aid, both to those in Rakhine State and those who are in Bangladesh, who have fled. The second is working with working with advocacy groups. We have advocacy specifically in DC, and we're working with the UN and ensuring that as much publicity as possible gets paid attention to this issue. We are advocating for, we're essentially advocating that all governments not deal in arms with the Burmese, and specifically the military, not necessarily the government, because we know how dire the situation is in Burma in general, so it's specifically with the government, and working to advocate that other governments not sell arms to Burma. This, unfortunately, is not a new conflict. We have been there, been working on the ground, as I said, for the past 15 years, with about 30 to 40 organizations who have been dealing with human rights issues, of which the Rohingya is sort of a pillar of our efforts there. So I just want to say thank you again to everyone on behalf of AJWS, the leading Jewish voice really for the developing world and helping those realize their rights. And thank you very much.
Now we're going to do some Skyping. This will be fun. The person we're going to talk to or hear from by Skype is Aymin Tant. She is a Burmese-American immigrant, recent graduate of Cornell University's Asian Studies program, and she's co-founder of SADA, Buddhists for Peace, and she's been very active organizing in and around the Burmese-American community. And we got in touch with her from Jess Benjamin, who's sitting here in the front row, a board member of Buddhist Peace Fellowship, who we'll be talking to in the question and answer session. Thanks for joining us, Aymin. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. I really want to thank the organizers for planning this event and inviting all these amazing people to come speak. So I was asked to talk a bit about why it's so rare to hear Burmese Buddhists speaking out on this issue in support of the Rohingya, or sort of what might pose difficulties for these people to speak out. And I would like to start to answer that by reading a statement written by A.A. Dun, the other co-founder of SADA. It goes like this. As diasporic Burmese Buddhists of different ethnic backgrounds who all reside around the world, we condemn the war crimes and genocidal atrocities committed by the Myanmar Army in Rakhine State. We are firmly against any ideals that prize ethno-religious supremacy and state campaigns that target minority groups such as the Rohingya, along with other ethnic groups in Rakhine, Kachin, Karen, Chin, and Shan states. We denounce any politicians, monks, and activists who perpetrate this violence. So this is a statement that we felt had very broad appeal and a sort of, while still being committed to justice, a very lukewarm denouncement of what is objectively evil. And yet, so far, we only have 9 signees. And the most common reason people have refused to sign is fear. So there's the fear of rejection from family. One of our members was recently asked by her parents if, because of the work she's doing with SADA, if she's now working for ISIS. There's the fear of rejection from one's community. Communities in Myanmar and abroad are often structured around ethnic and religious lines. So support of this racialized other is often seen as betrayal. And you have people who are weighing the options of choosing between everyone that they hold dear, people they know in real life, and strangers in the refugee camp. And then there's the fear of the Myanmar government. Something that I think about a lot is how my activism will affect my ability to travel to Myanmar. It's still common practice for the government to blacklist and jail those that they deem politically dangerous. In addition to that, even if my personal academic and work interests weren't in Myanmar, my family is. So in doing this work, I have to ask myself if I'm putting myself in danger, and what if I can't ever see my family again? And I ask these questions as a US citizen with a graduate degree. I have an immense amount of opportunities and privileges in life. So we have to imagine how much harder it is for those the average Burmese Buddhist to speak out against this issue, and how much more fear that they need to combat in order to do so. Now, we also have to add in state propaganda. The vast majority of our elders and community and religious leaders telling them that the Rohingya are illegal immigrants at best and terrorists at worst, and a culture of putting your head down and protecting your own, instilled by a regime that was once considered the most repressive in the world, second only to North Korea. And I say all this not to excuse the silence and complicity of the Buddhist majority, but to highlight that there are repercussions, real and imagined, that hold people back. There's a lot of work that we need to do within our own communities to support those who believe in justice. We need to embolden and encourage those voices, but doing so often comes at a cost. And as far as I see it, the work that we have ahead of us as Sittwe, as Burmese Buddhists, as people who care about human dignity and lives, is convincing everyone that these things are worth fighting for, regardless of those costs.
I'm Tan. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask a quick question. Most people, I think the average American thinks, oh, Buddhism, the religion of peace. And we hear about, and we saw in the film some of the really militant Buddhists out there, these militant Buddhist rallies. Could you help us understand them and their political power and why they do what they do? What is their strategy? Who are these people a little bit?
Sure. So I'd like to preface this by saying I'm not a religious studies scholar. So I'm going off of sort of personal experiences and classes that I have taken on Buddhism and sort of just personal interest research that I've done. But I do think, exactly as you said, people in the West often see Buddhism as a religion of peace, and that's something we really need to get away from. Buddhism, like any other religious ideology, is open to corruption and open to being used and militarized to just really terrible ends. And it's not as if we don't have other histories and stories that could show us the ways in which Buddhism has been used to violent ends before. So if you take a look at Sri Lanka and the violent campaigns there that were centered around Buddhist nationalism, we can see the ways in which what's happening in Burma echoes what has happened in Sri Lanka, and how conversations between Sri Lanka and Burma have fed into violence and ethno-nationalism within both of those countries. I think something else that people often don't quite understand is that the Burmese form of Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, is quite different and distinct from other forms of Buddhism. So Burma, Sri Lanka, and to a certain extent Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia are all Theravada Buddhist countries. But the type of Buddhism that in America that we're most commonly familiar with tend to be Zen Buddhism and to a certain extent Mahayana Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism. And so they all have very different histories and they all emphasize very different things. So the Burmese form of Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, it translates into sort of the way of the elders. And so it's a strain that is much more resistant to change, much more interested in purity, and sort of the preservation of the quote-unquote original content of Buddhism. And so on top of that sort of ideology of religion that is already different from Zen Buddhism and other types of Buddhism, you add in sort of a nationalism that was bred by a regime that tried to justify itself by saying, if we Westernize, if we become like even other Asian countries, if we let go of the violent ways in which we're repressing sort of these threats to the nation, as they like to phrase it, during the military regime, Burma will be destroyed. Buddhism will be destroyed. And yeah, so you have all these factors sort of coming into play here.
Thank you very much. That was very enlightening. We're going to slip away to the next speaker here, but we'll come back to you during the question and answer session.
Okay. I'm going to turn my camera off so I don't have to look at myself for too long.
Good idea. Next, we're going to hear from Tausif Akbar, who is the Web Contact Director for Burma Task Force in their campaign. He is a research director at CARE Chicago, and he studies Arabic and foundational Islamic disciplines, and he has been active with CARE on Islamophobia and the study of Islamophobia research. And Tausif, coming up.
Thank you very much, CTS, for having this space and all of the speakers. There's been a lot that's been shared today, a lot of heavy stuff as well, and you have a lot to take away with you. I'm going to mostly be speaking about what can be done, what can we do, what Burma Task Force does. Like Jerome said, I am the web content director at Burma Task Force, but I also wear various hats, when it comes to advocacy, doing legislation. A little bit about Burma Task Force. It is a coalition of 18 North American Muslim organizations, so that includes CARE, that includes MANA, ISNA, ICNA, and a few other of these acronyms that you may not be familiar with. But these are the major Muslim organizations in America and Canada. And our focus really since the start has been to, really urgently scream and make our voices loud as possible about the atrocities that are going on, who the Rohingya people are. A lot of Muslims were not even aware of the Rohingya until quite recently. As Dr. Sahlul indicated, this is quite a new phenomenon, quite a new crisis for a lot of people, even though it's been going on for quite some time. So getting right into exactly what we can do, number one is to recognize that this is a genocide. What is occurring fits the definition of genocide. In 2015, there was a conference at Oslo with the Nobel Committee in which you had Desmond Tutu and 7 other Nobel Prize winners who came and spoke about the issue, discussed what was going on, and in their concluding remarks said that this is a textbook case of genocide. And from there, you've had study after study after study. You had Queen's Mary University in London came out with a report about why this is a genocide and how this fits genocide. You had Fortify Rights, which is an organization in Thailand, who did an investigative report along with Al Jazeera and Yale Lowenstein Center for Law Center, in which Fortify Rights had discovered all these texts and evidence that they had received from sources within the government of Burma, the military dictatorship at the time, and it proved that there was a systematic attempt to annihilate and destroy the Rohingya people. And just recently, maybe a week or 2 weeks ago, the U.S. Holocaust Museum, as well as Fortify Rights, came out with a report detailing the genocidal atrocities that are going on. And so this is an established kind of fact. And Rex Tillerson, our Secretary of State, he went over to Burma, and when he came back, he called it an ethnic cleansing. And we don't really use this term because ethnic cleansing, if you look into the origin of the term, it was started by Slobodan Milosevic as a kind of way of sanitizing what's going on. There's no real legal weight behind that term of what can be done. It's really a way to skirt away from using the correct term of what's actually being done and used. And so I really urge you, look into the resources. If you go to the Burma Task Force website, burmataskforce.org, and if you see any of these materials that are laid down here on the seats, you can see the website and a few issues that we highlight, and you'll find resource pages. And those resource pages, will have the studies. They will have the kind of timeline of what has been going on since 1948 until today. And also, the second part of what I wanted to talk about is what you can do. There are 2 companion bills that a lot of our organizations have been working on to get, inserted into Congress, and they're there now. They've been introduced by Senator Dick Durbin, Senator Merkley, and in the House there's a companion bill with pretty similar language that goes beyond just mere condemnation, because in the past we've had bills that have been passed that, condemn Myanmar for what they do, but this goes a step further. So if you look onto our website, it's Senate Bill 2060 and House Resolution 4223. And these put in place targeted sanctions against the Burmese military leaders, generals who are doing who are behind this operation and the operations that are going on against the Rohingya community. And they also go on to provide greater relief, and they mandate that the U.S. must work to prevent the persecution of the Rohingya. And so these are really what I want to draw your attention to. And I think maybe we can get started with the panel next. Thank you very much. Look forward to talking with you.
We're going to have some conversation and some question and answer, and I hope everybody will pitch in. I think we can. I can run out, and if you hold your hand up, I'll put the microphone in front of your face. I'm going to start with the first question, and I don't. If we could get the panelists to come up, then they'll be able to address things and have microphones. We have a question over here. I'm in.
No, the lady on the screen.
Yeah,
Hi. Hi, this is Dr. Naz, Praveen Naz. I'm an nephrologist. I come from India, and we see a lot of Islamophobia there right now going on. And we've been working on it. You know, the educated lot, the elite and the educated lot have been working on it. And my question to you is, this apartheid that has been going on in Burma has been there for 50 years. How much Rohingya phobia, or whatever you want to call it, has been there, and how much has the community, the other community, has realized and has even looked into it and worked on it, or has been made aware? I mean, we really are working very hard in India. And I find it very unfortunate that there is hardly any response among the Burmese Buddhists against these atrocities for 50 years.
Ayman, do you want to respond to that? It's been hard for people to work on the issue, I imagine.
So I'm having a very hard time hearing. Could you repeat the question?
Sure, I'll kind of summarize. The questioner was from India, and they've had a lot of sectarian and Islamophobia problems in India, and they've are perpetually working on them, and they feel like they're working on the issue, but she doesn't see it happening in Burma. What happened during the last 50 years? Why didn't people work on the issue?
So we're definitely not working on the issue. I would argue that we are actively working against the issue, especially on the legal level. So I don't know how familiar people are with Burmese laws, but we recently, and by recently I mean like maybe 5 years ago, passed a set of laws called the Protection of Race and Religion, which basically codified several laws that promote the segregation of Muslims and Buddhists, especially Muslim men and Buddhist women. And limited the amount of children certain Muslim groups can have, and made it much more difficult for people to convert to Islam without sort of actively having to fear for their safety and sort of position in the community. And as to, it's the situation, I would say, is actually getting worse. As to why we haven't worked on the issue, I would argue that that has a lot to do with how independence was framed when we were fighting for independence from the British. So one of the very first protests against British colonization in Burma was to not be seen as part of British India. And so the sort of national identity of identifying themselves against the sort of South Asian other, which was both sort of racialized as, you know, these like sort of dark-skinned heathens, as well as these people who were largely Muslim, who were coming into the country as British colonial officers. So, like, from the very inception of Burma as a post-colonial nation, we were seen as a non-Muslim, non-South Asian country. And so, with that sort of basis, it's quite difficult to embrace the sort of effects of long-term migration in addition to colonial movements. And one of the very second protests against the British was against white people basically wearing shoes in Buddhist pagodas. And so, and movements growing from those sorts of protests. And so you see from the very inception of the understanding of Burma as a unified and independent nation, we have this idea of sort of ethnic solidarity against this sort of firm idea of the other, as well as religious solidarity around Buddhism, despite the vast diversity in the country.
What did you make? I noticed today, you know, the Pope is in Burma, and he was talking with the head of the military, the man who is responsible for the military actions in Rakhine State, and the head of the military said there is no religious discrimination in Burma, and he was saying this on behalf of you know, the Rohingya, I imagined, although he doesn't say the word Rohingya because nobody says the word Rohingya. And there's 700,000 Catholics in the country, and they're afraid to say the word Rohingya. And it's how do you? Is there any? Jeannie, do you want to say it? And does anybody else want to pipe up about this?
Yeah. What was the question again?
It was kind of like, well, how can like the military itself hold these ideas that there is no religious discrimination in Burma and be doing this stuff at the same time?
I mean, I think there's this effort to kind of do PR, you know, to the outside world. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Yeah, I mean, what you see is this effort to kind of show this two-sided face. I mean, it's what I've encountered in my studies of the situation, and when I'm talking to, you know, Rohingya and others from the region, is, you know, when it comes to the state counselor, they don't use the term either. So it's not just the military; it's also the state counselor. And there's been this effort, you know, to promote this narrative for decades now that they're illegal Bengalis who, you know, that these are not their ancestral homes. And it's part and parcel of, you know, since there's been this democracy movement and, you know, Aung San Suu Kyi's been elected leader of the nation, now you have a situation in which there's this kind of game of facade of democracy, and, you know, in which they kind of have to play that. So there's this, they're trying to navigate and kind of have their cake and eat it too.
They're lying?
Yes, they're lying.
Jeannie, do you want to say something about that? Do you have some?
Well, I think as my colleague pointed out, it's you cannot underestimate the collective psyche of growing up for 50 years under absolute dictatorship and how that permeates the fabric of every life in the country. And part of the reason that the military were able to continue their grip on the country was through the use of something that wasn't a weapon. It was pitting people against one another and using the paranoia and the fear of that to keep each other in check. So I think it's not something that is a simple answer, as our colleague was talking about, and it is, you know, terribly ironic that today, an historic visit by the Pope, who has recently made a remark using the R word, as it's now called. Literally, you cannot even mentioning the R word in Burma will bring great emotional response and anger to people. But I think we have to kind of transcend the issue, in a sense, of Rakhine State and the Rohingya and understand that this is an extremely fragile political transition being navigated by Aung San Suu Kyi. And I am not somebody who calls her to the carpet as such in the culpability of these grave human rights abuses, because her party, the National League for Democracy, did not burn, pillage, rape, and murder people. General Min Aung Hlaing and the military and the armed forces who remain in control in this fragile democracy are the ones who are culpable for this. So I think what's really needed here is a macro view of understanding accountability and transitional justice.
We've got a bunch of questions. I want to get to a bunch of questions here. John Kaler, you want to pipe in?
One way of looking at this particular issue is just think of Jim Crow in the South after 1865. It's exactly the same thing. It's just the South of this country, but it's exactly the same blindness in the face of oppression. My question is this. Even though the crisis is in the very beginning with regards to the displacement, the camps aren't even solidified yet. They're beginning to talk about refoulement already. And my question is, how do we fight this? Our State Department is decimated. They come up with in an exercise in belaboring the obvious, they come up with a statement that is ethnic cleansing. But refoulement, or the forced repatriation, is a real issue on the table, and people are speaking about it as if it's a positive solution. How do we address that?
And
I can have one comment about this, that today there was a report from IRC that they had a poll among the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, and 90% of them said that we're not going to go back. Only 10% or 11% said that we will be going back if we had that option. So I think that's definitely, and when I asked the refugees, are you going to go back? They said no. Everyone I asked them, they said no. One more comment about the previous question, though. This last week there was the ICCI trial of Mladic. Many of the Serbs still believe that he's a hero until now. Many people who support Assad thinks that he's a hero. So I think when you dehumanize the other, your group who follows you, they do the same.
Just one real quick is we need to discuss like safe zones if there's going to be, and there's no possibility of the so-called model villages that has been kind of put out there by Suu Kyi and her government, and because they want to go back to where they actually lived. These model villages really are the concentration camps all over again, and the fear is these are going to be perpetual. And so the discussion amongst a lot of us has been, what is the possibility of a safe zone in which possibly the UN is involved and they have the ability to use force? Yes.
We've got a question back here.
My name is Yasmin Khan. I'm a PhD student in human geography at University of Toronto. And I've been working with the Rohingya for about 2 years. Last time I was there was in May, when nobody knew anything about Rohingya really in the Western world. And just a couple of comments. Last time I was there in May in Cox's Bazar and in the camps, and I'm doing a critique, basically critiquing humanitarian aid and this idea that we're giving aid for 40 years. It's not aid anymore for 30, 40, 50 years. And it's surprising that in May, really, even when I was in Bangladesh, I wasn't allowed to say I'm working with the Rohingya, even in Bangladesh. I'm not allowed to use the word, for example, I've been collaborating with BROC. I don't know if people are familiar with BROC. It's a huge, now international organization. Even with BROC, I'm not allowed to say Rohingya now, today. I'm supposed to call the Rohingya Myanmar nationals, even after all of this coming out in the news. So one other surprising thing when I was there in May is the idea that, the idea of mistrusting refugees it's gone throughout history with lots of different people who have been forcibly displaced. But my first visit to the camps, even the United Nations, the UNHCR, the World Food Program, and the IOM, which is oddly in charge of a lot of these camps, they even claimed that Rohingya were lying about what happened to them, which was very disheartening. And this was, of course, when I was there, and there was not any news about the Rohingya. There wasn't. I'm going back next month, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot more. There's going to be flags and signs and all kinds of aid, everything, everywhere. But in May, there was nothing. And there was a huge lack of food. People didn't have food security, even though supposedly the World Food Program was giving people food. So in the end, my questions now are surrounding this idea of the spectacular. What was it? There were 500,000 people there in May, and nobody knew about the Rohingya. And now we have 1 million. What's the tipping point that we have to get to now globally to start paying attention? That part is really frustrating to me about we have to have 1 million people and a huge mass displacement within a month in order to pay attention on this side of the world. And the other piece that I'm wondering about that I'd like to explore and like to hear some comments on is this move from responsibility to accountability, this move from being responsible for feeding, for protecting, for medical care for 1 million people, to the accountability of the fact that a lot of the displacement is happening to help with production of palm oil, of mining interest, of jade, of a lot of land grabbing that's happening in Myanmar, and that's where people are being pushed out of. And the accountability in the global north of the West for the production of this land and how it's helping us while it's displacing tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. So I seem to see that there's a disconnect between the fact that we are saving refugees, and then we're also part of the displacement here in Canada and the United States and part of the global north. So I'd like to know a little bit about what you guys think about the accountability of it besides responsibility.
I just want to make sure I understand the question. The question is, what is the tipping point at which we will garner enough attention, or how are we going to be able to shift the response from aid to accountability? Well, from my vantage point, and admittedly, I personally have not been to Burma. I'm going to talk from an organizational perspective of how we believe to affect change. It's very difficult to sort of swoop in and deal with the aid situation without understanding partners on the ground, understanding people who have lived through this atrocity, and people who know what the needs are, both on the ground and also in Bangladesh. So I can't, I don't work with our program insofar as I don't have an answer for you about the accountability. All I can tell you is we are responsible to build relationships with those who are extremely vulnerable. And we have been doing that for a long, long time. And it's building those relationships and working with communities on the ground, not just to affect the immediate situation, but also to deal with the underpinnings of the situation, and working with individuals to make sure, as we saw in the film, that we can get children playing together again and understanding that we all are human beings. I will defer on sort of the larger question. Jeannie, if you want to.
Yeah, Jeannie, I mean, people might remember in the past, Unocal was building a pipeline across Burma, and they were using slave labor for that. And there's a economic argument millions of places. Colombia, people get moved off the land so that people can run oil and all that. Is any of that going on in Rakhine State?
Yeah, absolutely. And in reference to how much pain is needed before we take note, my heart stopped when the good doctor mentioned Yemen, because this is another part of the world where it's wholly unacceptable to have this kind of suffering and famine affecting that many children. It's completely unacceptable. I would say that I know the entire UNHCR staff in Cox's Bazar, including their just recently left chief of mission, and they're outstanding. One of them is a Bengali national who's been working with the Rohingya since 1991, and they were really remarkable in the work that they've done. And I think we have to distinguish between policy and humanitarian aid, because what you're talking about in terms of accountability is really on a policy and a political level. And I completely agree that accountability has to be a priority globally, not just in Burma, because the corporatocracy and the dictates of corporations, which includes the massive pillage and rape of natural resources and land, is indeed much of the foundation upon which conflicts are based. So in Rakhine State, very briefly, I can tell you that there are some analysts who do make the connection between the construction of the largest dual pipeline in Asia. It is a natural gas and oil pipeline that is being built in partnership with the Myanmar Oil and Gas Enterprise, which is a military-owned and operated state enterprise in partnership with China National Petroleum. It's a $3.56 billion project, and it includes a massive export processing zone as well as an oil processing zone in the Bay of Bengal, just on the edge of what is Rakhine State. So it is not a coincidence that much of the displacement that has happened across Rakhine State, this oil and natural gas is being delivered from Rakhine State clear across Shan State into Kunming, China. And there have indeed been well-documented reports of massive land grabbing, even those that have recently left. This is an issue which is, to your question, why there is nothing, apart from the fact that everybody is still reeling from the trauma of what they've just experienced. It's preposterous to even propose at this point. It's quite premature to propose any form of return when there is no safety and security, and when the vitriol and the hatred that we've heard our colleague speak of has not abated at all, if in fact it's exacerbated as a result of this. So I do agree with that, but I think that, I think collectively, we as human beings get overwhelmed with the tremendous amount of suffering and conflicts that are happening, and our own feelings of impotence to act upon them and to be agents of change within that, whether it's Yemen or Rakhine State or Charlottesville or racism right here in the United States, right? So there should not even be a tipping point. I think at any time and every time that we see an injustice, to the best of your ability, you have to be involved and you have to speak out. And the complicity of silence is something that's not something that you want to make your choice.
I want to pick up on your mentioning of Aung San Suu Kyi, and not to lay the atrocities at her feet, but the world has expressed disappointment in her inability or unwillingness to speak out more forthrightly about the atrocities, and even to participate in some of the discourse that tries to cleanse it. There was a story in the New York Times today about how little power she really has, and really did frame for the American reader a little more broadly the control that the army still has. My question is, what realistically could she do, and could the global leaders call upon her to do that would have some impact?
Yeah, my colleague Mia Win from Smile Education, who had to leave earlier than myself back to Burma, and I were asked this at every single event that we've done across the country and by every media who we met. And I have had the honor and privilege to know and work with Aung San Suu Kyi for many years whilst she was still under house arrest, and in the interim periods when during her release, in the multiple times that she was under house arrest. And I believe her to be a woman who is a true Buddhist and who has a deep humanity about her. And there is no question about the tremendous sacrifice and convictions that she's had that's even brought Burma to the point that it's at right now in this fragile political transition. There has been deep disappointment by many, particularly civil society and human rights activists, both inside the country, less so, I would say, inside the country, I would say more so outside the country, at what has been seen to be her unusual silence on this issue. And as the Times piece pointed out, she is walking this extremely perilous and fragile tightrope, because I think it's important for people to realize that whilst this is a transition, it is going to be a long transition. A country does not emerge from half a century of military rule in a few years. And the country is still under military rule. The 2008 Constitution, which was drafted over a period of 15 years, was voted upon in a referendum during Burma's greatest national natural crisis, Cyclone Nargis, when 137,000 people were killed, and they held a referendum for their constitution in the midst of this. This is the level of disassociation from reality that the generals have. And that constitution allocates 25% of parliament to be reserved by appointment from the military. And in order to enact any legislative reform in Burma, you need a 76% vote. So this gives you a sense. The colleague who is the chairman of the board of the organization with whom I work is someone who's not oft mentioned, but is really one of the great human rights heroes, U Ko Ni. He was a prominent human rights lawyer, and he was a constitutional expert who happened to be Burmese Muslim, as my colleague Mia Win is. And when the 2016 crisis happened, which we filmed the survivors of, he was asked to join a delegation sent by Aung San Suu Kyi to Jakarta because the ASEAN nations surrounding Burma are also concerned about this crisis. And it was a peace-building mission. And upon his return at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, his daughter handed him her child, and he was assassinated in broad daylight. And he was the chairman of the board of the organization with whom I work. So I think that we cannot underestimate, as she's mentioned, that the inculcated fear and control that the Burmese military wielded for half a century is still very much present. And I don't think it's additive or contributive in any way to look for solutions by stripping Aung San Suu Kyi of degrees or removing her portrait from the wall. I don't see how that, I'm not saying you were saying that, but it has become a sort of, she has become the iconic kind of punching bag, but she is a politician. And I'm not excusing or justifying her silence, but I don't think her silence also should not perhaps be mistaken as indifference, is all my point is. And what she did do, that was an action that she took. She's a person of action more so than words, and she's not a big fan of the media, as it were. She asked the former Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, to form a commission to investigate Rakhine State. And they did so, albeit an imperfect commission. But the findings of that report, which I have thoroughly studied, were excellent. It was comprehensive. It covered every single aspect of the root causes of conflict: social inequity, lack of education, lack of health care, lack of citizenship. And it called for the urgent and immediate instatement of citizenship status for the Rohingya. And this was her action. And the Rohingya self-described militants who took the action against the police did so the day after the report was released.
So if I could chime in on that question? Or
Sure.
Hi, sorry. So I think part of, I definitely agree with a lot of what was just said. I think a lot of the sort of Western disappointment with Aung San Suu Kyi has been largely a product of the way in which we built her up and built up sort of our internalized image of her. Because if you go back and read her writings and listen to the way she's spoken, she's always referred to the Burmese military as my father's army. She's always been a deeply religious person who, for better or worse, is very proud of her ethnic heritage in a way that sometimes manifests in her not quite being able to see the ways in which Burmans are often privileged, both in law, but also sort of culturally in Burma. And the way in which she is being stripped of her honors and sort of just generally chastised as if she is a sort of reluctant child who is not following the rules of being a global leader, I think it's very counterproductive. And it ignores the ways in which, as much as we as Westerners might be disappointed in her, Burmese people who call her mother, like we call her Ame Sue, Mother Sue, who saw her as this great hope and aren't seeing the sort of changes that we hope to see, are that much more disappointed. And she has stated herself that she is now a politician. And she's being stripped of honors in a way in which Barack Obama, who has ordered military strikes on children, has not been, despite the fact that she has not personally ordered any of these atrocities and does not have the ability to stop them. I think what she could do, and sort of what might make us all feel good, is to use all of her moral authority in one go and say the Rohingya are part of this country, they are an ethnic minority, they are indigenous, and devote the rest of her life to that. And she could do that, and it would be the right thing to do. But she is nearing the end of her life. Her doing this does not guarantee success. And there are very few people who have the capacity to lead the country in the way that she does. Now, this is partially something we can criticize her for as well. She's not good at delegating tasks. She is not good at letting go of control. And she's not good at trusting sort of younger, ambitious people. And she likes to appoint people she trusts regardless of their inability or lack of knowledge in running government, anything, really. But I think we really need to first and foremost let go of the image we've built up of her, because it's not doing us any good at this moment in time.
Very interesting.
I mean, I agree with everything that's said. It's a very complicated issue, especially when the military is still in control. You know, they controlled 3 major security institutions. You're talking about the border patrol, the border police, internal police, and of course the Tatmadaw, which is the military, you know, which encompasses it all. That said, I mean, it's not true to say that she's been completely silent, you know, because she does control the Ministry of Information. She does control a few other aspects. And, you know, I totally agree with the last speaker in that there's a lot more that she could have done. It's not just mere disappointment. I mean, the most disappointed, of course, are the Rohingya, who put a lot of faith in her. You know, a lot of people have put a lot of faith in her. And when you have a Ministry of Information that says and compares Rohingya to fleas, why is that happening? Or when she's questioned about rape, when she was a humanitarian, she would say, yes, it is used as a war crime by our military, against ethnic minorities. But now, does she have to go as far as she did when she was in Malaysia and she was asked about, what are these reports? And it was called, she used the term fake rape. And so, I think we have to hold them to account when these kind of lies and propaganda are pushed. She is in a very precarious situation, and the Kofi Annan has been an excellent step that needs to be implemented. And that's one of the things that's also asked for in these resolutions in the House and Senate.
Well, I think we've heard a lot about the answer, and think about what's been said, and we're going to try to get some other questions.
Okay. I've been looking at the internet a lot on this issue, and we all know about the truth that you find on the internet. And I've seen a lot of comments that what's happening to the Rohingya in Myanmar and in Bangladesh is in essence a proxy war. And on the one side, people are saying it's China who is pulling the strings or has the ability to pull the strings on Burma. And on the other side, particularly with the militant Salvation Army raids, that it's either Pakistan or Saudi Arabia or both. And I don't know what's going on, but is there a possibility that you could sit some countries in a room that are not Burma and not Bangladesh, and that those other countries, with pressure put on them, could solve or ameliorate this crisis and stop the genocide?
Come on, it's your question all the way. It's China, isn't it, again?
Please, the doctor.
I'm not the expert in geopolitical proxy wars. I'm expert in Syria. I can tell you that there's proxy war in Syria. 13 countries are fighting in Syria, including the United States and Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Israel and everyone else. But, I was reading the newspaper in Bangladesh when I was in there last week, and they were talking about China, that China has good relationship with both Bangladesh and Myanmar, and they can influence what's happening in Myanmar, but they're kind of reluctant to do it so far. But I think China can hold definitely a lot of strings in that area.
They really like their Muslim population in China. They're doing them a lot of favors.
So I'm just wondering, as people and human beings, do we have to care a lot where to place the blame, on what country and which country to blame? Can't we just, as a human beings together, regardless of our nationalities, religions, just jump in to volunteer and take responsibility to help people who are suffering, instead of just discussing who should stand up and take the blame? And actually, I have another question. So as people and citizens from different countries, can we do anything to communicate with our politicians to do a concrete action to stop the suffering? Or just, instead of just for politicians to keep continuing to make the different meetings and thinking about the conflict without any concrete action, can we do something just to stop the suffering right away and be action-oriented and not to waste time?
I mean, that's definitely something that we want to work on as in Burma Task Force, and that's what we're drawing our attention to when it comes to the advocacy and the legislative side. So these, like I stress again, the Senate resolution and this House bill, we need people to, there is something you can do. You can call them to support this bill. Currently, there's 22 that support the Senate bill and equal number in the House. And this is a bipartisan issue. This is not a Republican, this is not a Democrat issue. And if you're from depending on what country you are, what are the relationships that your nation has with Burma? Pakistan, for instance, has a potential military deal where they're going to be sending jets they've made to the Burmese military. And there's been a great uproar in certain sectors of Pakistan. You can meet your ambassador and tell them, because if they don't hear the concern, they're going to continue doing this. A lot of the people, when we called the congressman, they're like, oh, I didn't even know this bill was, already introduced, or what this was about. And so it's important to get on the phone, especially for people who are in those districts. Thankfully we have Senator Durbin and Schakowsky who have been on this issue at least at the forefront, and so quite good. They just came back from a trip there in which they were in the camps, and Dr. Sahlul, I believe, met them as well. And so could tell you a little more about that trip. I think we're going to see some more in terms of what they found out. But they are talking about this as a genocide, which was not the case previously. And so, yes, there's a lot that can be done immediately.
The first question I like, because this is, instead of talking about others' responsibility, we can take responsibility, and every person can do something. I'm a physician practicing in Chicago. John is a physician practicing in Chicago, and we decided to do something. And we did not expect that we will have that many nurses and doctors interested in going to Bangladesh, an area that is very difficult to go to, that is perceived as dangerous, to treat population that we've never met, and we don't connect to them with language or culture. But when we started to publicize that we are going to help the Rohingya refugees, we had, within 1 week, 150 doctors and nurses lining to go. And right now, we started 2 months ago, we have 5 to 10 doctors and nurses coming from the United States, from the UK, from Australia, to go to Cox's Bazar, to the camp, which is under extreme heat and hot and humid and muddy, to treat these patients. So you can take the initiative, each one of you can take the initiative and do something, and you will be amazed how many people will follow you.
Hi, I'm Anarima. I'm a civil rights lawyer and work on transitional justice issues. I'm actually going to just double down on this question of what we can immediately do to address sort of this feeling of impotence about a lot of what's happening around the world. And I'm not a doctor or a nurse. And in some ways, I think there is as much of a malaise in this country about calling Congress on any issue right now as anything else. And so my question is simply about I have a short-term question, I have a longer-term question. The short-term question is, what would you recommend in terms of immediate assistance? I understand that sending money is not the way in which we want people to engage, but there's a question of awareness and there's a question of short-term action. And so I'm just trying to get a sense of where you would recommend that happening. And then on the longer-term end, I just want to go back to this conversation about the safe zone versus people going back to Myanmar, and what's your sense of where that push should be? And in some ways, if 288 villages have been razed and there's not some place to go back to, I'm just wondering whether the goal should be really to support communities where they are and people where they are. And then just a factual question related to whether people go back is how many Rohingya are actually still in the country, and how do we support them as well?
I can address the first part of your question. I think a lot of times when there are crises or disasters, there are a lot of organizations that are involved. And you'd be surprised at the amount of them that take a remarkable amount of overhead, and that your dollar becomes 5 cents when it actually arrives on the ground. So the only advice I would give in that regard is that there are rankings of various charities. Charity Navigator is one of them that allows you to, it demonstrates the value of the particular charities and how much goes to actual action versus overhead. I can't speak to all of them as it pertains to this particular situation, but when you are doing research, and if you are interested in donating, that's probably the first place that I would go.
I mean, we have 4 demands that we're asking that when people call, not just to support these 2, they need to be strengthened because they're not at the level, where we're completely satisfied, of course. These resolutions, these bills that are in Congress, we're asking for safe zones, Burma task forces, with real teeth. I mean, it sounds impossible. It sounds like, there's no way that Burma's going to allow that. But, this is a genocide. This needs to be stressed, that, it is an urgent matter. So if they do go back, this has happened 4 times in the past, in recent memory, where they've been expelled. Hundreds of thousands have been expelled, starting in 1978, Operation King Dragon, 80s, 90s, and then there's a repatriation deal. This recent one is based on the 92 repatriation deal. And, it's really the same scenario. And so, we're just, we're calling for these 4 demands, call it what it is, a genocide. We also need to, all the nations in the UN have endorsed R2P, responsibility to protect. And, that needs to be put into effect at some point as just not something. So getting our ambassadors to actually move on that. And it takes people power. It takes, a movement of people to get behind that. This, I just want to make a point, is one of the largest talks that I've seen, I mean, at least in Chicagoland, when it comes to people gathering to talk about the Rohingya. So, I mean, I take a lot of hope from this. I hope we can move to the next level from it as well.
Yeah, I think when we started to produce this film and when we aimed to release it and were stopped, it had been just 2 months before the August crisis. The October 2016 crisis had taken place, but we had no idea what was coming. And the primary reason we made the film was as a peace-building tool for fomenting interfaith dialogue and social cohesion, particularly among youth, diverse groups of youth in Burma. We have a Burmese language version of this film. And we are going forward with our plans, despite the fact that the film is banned and is illegal. It is not illegal in private viewings. And that's what I'm going back to do with Smile Education, is to have these very small, although they'll be very risky, screenings with young groups of youth and have an exchange of ideas via social media. We're going to carry the responses from the Buddhist communities to the Rohingya communities and vice versa. But the scale and the gravity of what has happened in the last few months is nothing like anything I've ever seen in 33 years of doing this work. The UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights, Yang Hee Lee, who spoke with my colleague in the United Nations when we showed the film, said that for the first time in her career, she had no words. And what has particularly upset me has been the sexual violence and the rape against girls as young as 12 and 11, as well as elderly women. So I think at this time, if anyone was going to request any action from your legislators and or State Department, or to even write, believe it or not, the UN Office on Human Rights has a website you can post. It's to urgently ask. There is a special rapporteur in the United Nations Human Rights Council for sexual violence in conflict areas. And I think this situation absolutely demands this immediately. And I think there is also a need for expanded mental health services for the post-traumatic stress disorders that the young girls have experienced. And there is an outreach needed among Rohingya women, the aunties and the grandmas and the moms of these girls as well as the survivors, because it is difficult to describe, as the doctor said, with the men crying. The hardest interviews that we did was when we went to Bangladesh and met the youth, only one of whom ended up in the film, but I couldn't sleep for nights. And these girls are being abused over and over again every single day, because it's not just the act that they have survived, but it's now the shame that they feel and the worthlessness that they feel. They feel their lives literally are over. They will never marry, they will never bear children, they will never have a normalcy of a life. This is unacceptable. So I would really call for support for the UN Special Rapporteur on Sexual Violence in Conflict Areas. And I also just wanted to say that the best discussions we had anywhere was with youth when we showed this film. We went to one high school, and then we had the great honor and privilege to go to the juvenile detention facility in San Francisco. And I shared this with my colleagues at Burma Task Force. And every single youth in the jail was a youth of color. No surprises there. They were all African American, Latino, and Pacific Islanders. And we showed it to a group, a girls' class, and then a boys' class, and Myo Win was with me. And they were so struck, right, by the film. And they have a counselor there, Dr. Carr, who grew up himself detained in the detention facility. He was a gangbanger. And he got out, got a scholarship, got a master's degree, and now works there as a counselor. And Dr. Carr is a towering 6'4", and Myo Win is about, 5'6", little rotund, jolly chap. And Dr. Carr leaned over to him and he said, "Brother, I gotta ask you now, did you ever read Harriet Tubman?" And he said, "No, who is Mr. Tubman?" He said, "Oh, no, it's not a mister. Now, I'm telling you now, you're going to go out, you're going to get a book on Harriet Tubman, and you're going to go back, and you're going to get one Buddhist and one Muslim. That's all you need, brother. Start with just 2 of them, and you're going to get them in a room, and they're going to start talking, and it will spread, and it will spread." And the kids were so moved because this girl stood up, Joy, and her parents, one of her parents is himself in jail, and her mother is in a facility. She's a crack addict, and she stood up and she said, "That's my history. I'm black. That's my story you just showed." So they spent the entire afternoon, they canceled classes and spent the entire afternoon in the school writing letters to the youth of Burma. And I just wanted to share some of this with you because there is no us and them. The times that we're living in, the political landscape of this country, the global political landscape that we're seeing around the world, not just in Rakhine State. We're seeing the resurgence of fascism in Italy. We're seeing the resurgence of nationalism in the Netherlands and Austria. We're living in you-know-where land. I won't use the T word like I won't use the R word, right? So it's a very thin line between Charlottesville and Sittwe, and between Sittwe and South Africa. And you can take action. You don't have to be a physician or a nurse. You can take action right where you live. You don't have to take action on the Rohingya. So I just wanted to share one of these letters because we thought it was pretty cool. My name is T2. I live in San Francisco. That's a place called America. I just watched that documentary, Sittwe, and it was alarming. A lot of people here don't know nothing about the problems you all are having. I'm African American. So I've been told my whole life that white people don't like us. But as I get older, I realized everybody has their own opinion. And you can't dislike or like any group of people just based on one person's doings. I think you guys are real smart, and I bet you got a lot going on if you had a chance. My advice to you is keep on fighting for your education. Learn as much as you can. Stand up. And be the change you want to see. In solidarity, with love, T2.
Do you want to ask one question here? Oh, good. Mesa organized this thing.
Oh. No, sorry. Yeah, let him talk.
There you go.
My name is Terrence Johnson, former educator. I would just like to ask Jean and Dr. Muhammad, the guests panelists have been to Burma. Considering your work and what you have done going there, I mean, I'd like to know any personal problems you've experienced, like suspicions, problems getting there, being monitored, you know, those kind of things I'd like to hear about.
None of that. I mean, I felt really at home. The people of Bangladesh are very welcoming. I was warned that, you know, there is, you know, maybe it's dangerous to go into that area, but actually what I've seen that people are good-hearted. We had interpreters from Bangladesh who speak the same language, who joined us every day. They were some of the nicest people. Maybe I can end with this story before you can talk about this. So we had, a couple of months ago, one of my friends, Andrea Capiccioni from San Francisco, she texted me, she said, I have some self-adjusted glasses that I can get you from pharmaceuticals. Do you think that you can do something with them and take them with you to Bangladesh to help the Rohingya? I said, please send them. And she sent me a bag of 200 eyeglasses, self-adjustable eyeglasses. And I did not, frankly, think that I'm going to use them there. I said I'm going to take them anyway. It was donated to the Rohingya. Luckily, in the same team that we had an eye specialist from Chicago. Her name is Dr. Samra Al-Hashimi. So she went to me, and we had no eye equipment. And we had a few, actually, older men and women who actually read. And they were complaining that they cannot read in the tent, in the camp. And one of them came and he said, I have eye problem. I directed him to Dr. Al-Hashimi, who saw him, and she gave him this self-adjustable glasses. And I forgot about him, and then I went out of the clinic. And then he came to me smiling. And he tapped on my shoulder, and he put his eyeglasses, and he smiled. And this is the best smile I've seen in my life. You know, sometimes you don't know that, you know, with the small, you know, very, you know, action, or random kind of action that you can do, and you can touch a life in distant land. And I guess that each one of us can do something like that. You can donate to organizations that are helping, and there are many of them. You can spread the word, you can write a post on your Facebook, and you'll be amazed how many people will benefit from that. So we were in Bangladesh. We did not go to Burma. We were not able to cross the border. We went to the border, and we looked at the border. It was one of the surreal experiences that we had. Very beautiful landscape, and we were told that this is the place that refugees were crossing, but we were not able to cross to Burma. And I mean, the Myanmar government does not give us permission to do that.
Your name is Daniel? Terrence. So do you moonlight for the Burmese military intelligence? Is that why you're asking this? Or I'm just wondering, like, I can't tip my hand here, Terrence. You know that, right? It was challenging to go to restricted areas, but I just wanted to leave on a positive note that we had help from many people who knew exactly what we were doing and why. And the people that helped us access the restricted areas behind the military lines were all Buddhists. And I think it's important for us to all remember that those loud people in the world, they want you to think they're the majority, but they're not. We are the majority. Love and kindness and mercy and hope, that's the majority.
And we want to just get a quick word in from Jess Benjamin, board member from the Buddhist Peace Fellowship.
Hi, everyone. I'm the redundant Buddhist here, so that's why you haven't heard from me earlier. But I just want to thank Ayman for what she said. There's really nothing that I can say that she hasn't already said, but what's come to mind has been that as the Buddhist Peace Fellowship is an organization that works for collective liberation through bringing activist tools to spiritual communities and also through bringing spiritual tools to activist communities. So we're really trying to marry the two in a way that feels productive and also encourages the tenets of Buddhism, which are peace and openness and non-harm. So, I think the change can only come about through collaboration. It's not only one person that's going to do this, and it's not only one organization. It's people making documentaries, it's people going in for medical care, it's people on the ground. But I would just encourage people to really do their best to educate themselves and also to really get to know the people who are on the ground there, or who have ties. And I know, for instance, Sada, like Ayman was saying, is a really excellent organization founded by Burmese Americans. And if you want direction about, where to go and what to do, look to people who have actual ties to the countries and to the people there. And also just to remember that, obviously the violence that's happening right now in Burma and, in other Buddhist nations in the name of, in this case, in the name of Buddhist nationalism is obviously antithetical to Buddhist teachings. And it's important to remember that there are much, much larger majorities of people Buddhists and everyone who are on that side, and that sometimes out of fear, people act in ways that they wouldn't have otherwise, or out of desperation. So it's just, I think, also important to, like in any situation, look thoroughly at all sides of the issue to really investigate, why, not to condone the behavior, obviously, but to really question, there's violence happening. It's counter to the narrative of Buddhism and to the teachings of Buddhism. Why might that be happening? Because obviously in an ideal world that wouldn't be happening. And I'm sure that there's a reason that the monastics in Burma feel that they are acting in the service of Buddhism. And why is that? So just to kind of investigate further, and then from there draw conclusions and take action in the way you see best fit.
Thank you. Yeah. Oh.
There is a lot of people asking. We touched upon this just a little bit, but we have a lot of people asking about relief organizations coming into Bangladesh to help the Rohingya. Are there any relief organizations that are banned from coming in to help? And for Dr. Zahir Sahlul, did you see any large organizations that we know about that are in Bangladesh helping out the Rohingya?
The hotels that we stayed in Cox's Bazar, and actually the few hotels there were full of NGOs and members of NGOs communities from all over the world. We've seen relief organizations coming from Malaysia, from Brunei, from Japan, from Norway. So 3 months ago, it looks like the Bangladeshi government opened the door to relief organizations. Probably you know that there are some organizations that were prohibited from going there, mostly Islamic relief organizations for whatever reason. But I've seen many NGOs from all over the world there, which was very refreshing, from South Africa, from Europe, from United States. But relief has its own problems also, because some organizations come with a baggage, and some organizations come to proselytize, some organizations come to exploit, and so relief is not all pure and it's not all good.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you for caring, and let's go out there and get them.